Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell.
This speech did not get very much attention. When a new president is coming to power, as John Kennedy was, the spotlight was not on Dwight Eisenhower.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
There was a feeling at the time that this must have been written by some speechwriter who just sneaked into the speech.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
3 months ago, we got contacted by a family up in Minnesota saying that we have documents from Malcolm Moose. He was responsible in part for drafting the military-industrial complex speech.
These new papers give us written evidence that this was not just some caprice of Eisenhower's or something by some speechwriter.
You see the evolution of his speech from May 1959 to 1961.
And he wanted to give this speech for a long time, 2 years.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea.
There was one person in Dwight Eisenhower's life whom he really confided almost everything to, and that was his brother Milton.
There's one particular document where the speechwriters had already drafted their version of the speech, only to see Milton come along and totally revamp what had already been written.
When Milton Eisenhower was taking notes and writing things on the drafts of these speeches, the speechwriters knew that it wasn't Milton talking, it was Ike.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
He would see magazines with advertisements for some new warplane or some bomb, and he got so angry he'd take the magazine and throw it into the fireplace of the Oval Office because he felt that defense spending should not be something that would be encouraged by companies who are seeking commercial gain.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
There is an interesting document. It shows that the farewell speech would be made to Congress. But yet, President Eisenhower decided, no, he was going to address the people.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
One test of how well a president speaks is how long the speech lives. Here we are 50 years later, we're still talking about this speech.
Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
53 years ago, as President Eisenhower was leaving office, he gave a farewell speech so profound and prescient that it continues to send chills down the spine of those who listen to it today. It was not only a speech, but a warning to every U.S. citizen that the defense industry had begun its takeover of America's democracy. Despite the fact that this speech has become the most memorable moment of Eisenhower's presidency, he was largely responsible for the unabated growth of the U.S. military machine during the height of the Cold War. And knowing the role he played in the military-industrial complex, perhaps it was guilt that led him to give this grave address.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations.
Think about what he said for 1 second. In 1961, the U.S. was already spending more on its defense than the net income of all U.S. corporations at the time. If Eisenhower thought that was a disturbing trend, I wonder what he'd think now that U.S. corporations have become bigger than many countries. For example, GE's GDP is bigger than New Zealand, and Yahoo is bigger than Mongolia. But Eisenhower would be rolling in his grave if he could see the extremes that the U.S. military-industrial complex has reached today. In fact, the U.S. now spends more on military expenses than the next 10 largest countries combined. Yet the government continues to deceptively claim that only 24% of its expenditures are for national defense. However, independent watchdog organizations have broken down the true costs of U.S. imperialism. According to the War Resisters League, 29% of the budget from 2012 went to fund current military operations, and a whopping 18% went to fund past military ventures. Yes, believe it or not, we're still paying off debt from the Civil War. But there's another reason why the anniversary of Eisenhower's speech is eerily symbolic. January 17th was the same day that Obama chose to give his own speech on NSA reform. It was full of empty platitudes and ultimately proved that there would be no change to global unconstitutional spying. This dragnet surveillance program is perhaps one of the biggest hindrances of modern liberty and democracy. And oddly enough, Eisenhower addressed just that.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Unfortunately, Eisenhower's message fell on deaf ears as generation after generation relinquished more and more power to feed the military beast. And sadly, no president since then has had the courage to confront our addiction to war, even if it means the destruction of our society.